The United Nations General Assembly Hall fell silent as the massive holographic displays flickered to life. Outside the reinforced windows of the New York headquarters, 3 enormous Kralzar diplomatic vessels hung in low Earth orbit, their obsidian black hulls absorbing and reflecting the late afternoon sunlight like impossible shadows. Dr. Elena Rodriguez gripped the edge of her tablet, her dark eyes scanning the rapidly updating threat assessment models. At 38, she represented a new generation of systems theorists, part quantum physicist, part global crisis management expert, and entirely unimpressed by bureaucratic posturing. The emergency session had been called with less than 4 hours' notice, bringing together a hastily assembled group of scientific advisors, diplomatic representatives, and military strategists. "We are not here to negotiate," proclaimed Ambassador Vexnar of the Kralzar Confederacy, his translucent skin shifting between shades of pale blue and silvery gray. The universal translator rendered his words with a clinical precision that failed to mask the underlying condescension. "Humanity has been identified as a Class D developing civilization. Our role is to provide guidance and establish preliminary containment protocols." A ripple of murmurs swept through the assembly. Containment. The word hung in the air like a threat. Elena watched the alien diplomat with a mixture of professional curiosity and barely concealed irritation. The Kralzar were known throughout their stellar domain as meticulous bureaucrats, more committed to procedural complexity than actual problem-solving. Their civilization had unified dozens of species under a framework of rigid hierarchical control, and they clearly viewed humanity as nothing more than another potential administrative unit. What they didn't know was that Elena had spent the last 17 months developing a revolutionary crisis management algorithm. Her work merged quantum computing principles with adaptive network theory, creating a system that could predict and mitigate complex global challenges with unprecedented accuracy. As Ambassador Vexnar continued his patronizing speech, Elena's fingers danced across her tablet. The UN's emergency response network was experiencing multiple simultaneous stress points: a climate refugee crisis in Southeast Asia, potential infrastructure collapse in 3 major coastal cities, and escalating tensions in multiple global conflict zones. Conventional diplomatic and management strategies would fail within hours. Her algorithm could change everything. Dr. Rodriguez interrupted Secretary General Adebayo. "Do you have any insights regarding the Kralzar's initial assessment?" The room turned. Elena knew this was more than a simple request for information. It was a challenge, a moment to demonstrate humanity's capabilities. "With all due respect," she began, her voice calm and precise, "the Kralzar's assessment is fundamentally flawed. We're not a civilization to be contained. We're a dynamic, adaptive system." Ambassador Vexnar's skin flickered. A Kralzar tells of confusion and slight irritation. Elena's tablet projected a complex holographic model. Multiple interconnected networks began to pulse and shift, showing real-time crisis points transforming, redirecting, resolving themselves through intricate, almost organic patterns of human cooperation. "Our strength isn't in rigid hierarchies," she continued, "but in our ability to rapidly reconfigure, to transform challenges into opportunities. Watch." The hologram demonstrated how her algorithm could predict and mitigate global challenges by creating temporary, purpose-driven networks of collaboration. Cities facing infrastructure collapse would be supported by remote teams. Refugee crisis resources would be dynamically redistributed. Conflict zones would see targeted interventions that addressed root psychological and economic triggers. Ambassador Vexnar's translator struggled to maintain its clinical tone. "This is unexpected." Unexpected. The word was an understatement. What the Kralzar saw as a primitive fractured species was actually a highly sophisticated, globally interconnected organism. Humanity wasn't a problem to be solved or contained. They were a solution waiting to be understood. Elena allowed herself the slightest smile. First contact was about to get very interesting. The diplomatic vessels outside began to shift their positioning, almost imperceptibly. Something had changed in their calculations about Earth, and they didn't even realize it yet. 48 hours after the UN assembly, the true nature of the Kralzar's containment became brutally clear. Global communication networks began to experience systematic restrictions. Research grants mysteriously vanished. International technology transfer protocols were rewritten overnight, creating labyrinthine bureaucratic barriers that would take months, if not years, to navigate. In a dimly lit co-working space in Sao Paulo, Marco Silva watched the restrictions unfold with a sardonic grin. At 29, he was part of a new generation of digital architects, part hacker, part systems designer, entirely committed to breaking down institutional barriers. "They think they can fence us in," he muttered, fingers flying across multiple holographic displays. What the Kralzar didn't understand was that their containment strategy was about to become the most effective catalyst for human innovation in history. Across the globe, a network began to form. Not through official channels, but through the invisible threads of human connection that no bureaucratic system could truly comprehend. A researcher in Mumbai suddenly found her stalled quantum computing project receiving anonymous cloud computing resources. A climate engineering team in Cape Town discovered encrypted communication channels that bypassed every known institutional firewall. Dr. Elena Rodriguez became the unintentional architect of this resistance. Her crisis management algorithm, initially developed for global humanitarian challenges, now became a blueprint for something far more radical. The same network analysis that could predict and mitigate global crises could also create an unprecedented collaborative infrastructure. In the Kralzar monitoring centers, their most advanced predictive systems began to show anomalies. Protocols that should have isolated human research groups were instead creating unexpected connection points. Restrictions meant to slow technological development were being transformed into accelerants. Every barrier became a challenge, every limitation a design constraint to be overcome. Aisha Okonkwo, a Nigerian systems engineer, laughed as she reviewed the latest network map. What looked like a series of disconnected research initiatives to an outside observer was actually a living, breathing collaborative organism. "They're trying to contain an ocean," she told her colleague in Lagos, "by building walls made of paper." The Kralzar had categorized humanity as a containment species, potentially dangerous but ultimately controllable. Their stellar bureaucracy had developed intricate systems for managing emerging civilizations, carefully controlling technological and economic development. They had never encountered a species quite like humans. In Berlin, a collective of quantum physicists and neural network designers began developing a distributed computing model that could operate beneath the Kralzar's monitoring capabilities. In Tokyo, a group of biotechnology researchers started exploring adaptive communication protocols that could transmit complex information through seemingly random data streams. Each restriction became an opportunity, each barrier a new avenue of innovation. Marco Silva's network map showed the truth. What looked like chaos to the Kralzar was actually the most sophisticated self-organizing system they had ever encountered. Humans weren't just adapting to the containment. They were using it as fuel for unprecedented collaboration. Containment, Marcos whispered to himself, more like a pressure cooker of human potential. The Kralzar monitoring systems continued to process their data, completely unaware that every algorithm they deployed was being studied, decoded, and transformed by a global network of human innovators. In the monitoring centers of the Kralzar diplomatic vessels, junior analysts began to notice strange patterns. Anomalies that couldn't be explained by their predictive models. Data flows that seemed to emerge from nowhere, interconnect in impossible ways, and then vanish. They were watching the birth of a new form of collective intelligence, and they didn't even know it yet. The containment trap was sprung, but not in the way the Kralzar had imagined. Instead of restricting humanity, they had just provided the ultimate catalyst for its transformation. The resource crisis struck with the subtlety of a quantum storm. Deep in the Andromeda cluster, the first warning signs emerged. Cascading energy matrix failures that rippled through multiple stellar civilizations. The Krulzar's primary energy infrastructure, a network of quantum-entangled resource collectors that had sustained their confederacy for millennia, began to collapse. Dr. Hiroshi Nakamura stood in the UN's Emergency Stellar Response Center, his weathered hands tracing holographic data streams that told a story of impending catastrophe. At 62, he was a veteran of global environmental restoration projects, with a reputation for finding solutions where others saw only impossible challenges. "It's not just a resource depletion," he muttered to Elena Rodriguez, who stood beside him. "It's a fundamental systems failure." The Krulzar had built their civilization on a network of quantum energy collectors that harvested dark energy from the interstices between galactic clusters. For thousands of years, this system had seemed invulnerable, a testament to their technological superiority. Now, those same collectors were fragmenting, their quantum coherence breaking down in ways that defied their most advanced predictive models. 317 inhabited systems faced total energy collapse within weeks. Ambassador Vexnar's holographic projection flickered with barely contained panic. "We require immediate intervention," he declared to the Emergency Council. "Our conventional mitigation strategies are insufficient." What he didn't say, what he couldn't say, was that the Krulzar had no real solution. Elena Rodriguez saw the opportunity hiding within the crisis. The global network they had been building, the collaborative infrastructure that had emerged from the Krulzar's containment attempt, now had its ultimate test. This wasn't just a human challenge. This was a galactic challenge. In a research facility outside Mumbai, Dr. Priya Venkatesh was already 3 steps ahead. Her team had been developing adaptive energy transfer technologies that drew inspiration from biological systems, specifically the way complex ecosystems manage energy flow. What the Krulzar saw as a rigid, centralized energy collection system, humans saw as a dynamic, adaptive network waiting to be reimagined. "We're not looking at energy collection," Priya explained to her diverse team of researchers. "We're looking at energy conversation." It was more than a technological solution. It was a philosophical approach that the Krulzar couldn't comprehend. Their energy systems treated resources as static, extractable commodities. The human approach saw energy as a living, dynamic process, something to be negotiated, transformed, redirected. Marcos Silva's global network came alive. Research facilities that had been working in isolation now found themselves part of a living, breathing collaborative organism. A quantum physics team in Berlin discovered their theoretical models aligned perfectly with a materials science breakthrough in Cape Town. An artificial intelligence research group in San Francisco provided predictive algorithms that transformed a theoretical energy transfer concept into a viable prototype. The Krulzar monitoring systems struggled to comprehend what was happening. This wasn't a coordinated response. It was something far more complex, a self-organizing system that emerged from millions of individual creative decisions. Dr. Nakamura watched the emerging solution with a sense of profound wonder. Humans weren't just solving a technological problem. They were demonstrating a fundamentally different way of understanding complexity. "They think we're going to save their civilization," he said quietly to Elena. "But we're actually going to show them how to reimagine what civilization means." As the first prototype adaptive energy transfer system came online, something extraordinary happened. It wasn't just a solution to the resource crisis. It was a complete reimagining of how energy could be understood, collected, distributed. The Krulzar had sought to contain humanity. Instead, they had unleashed something they could never have anticipated. A way of thinking that would transform not just one civilization, but the entire understanding of what intelligent systems could become. The resource crisis was about to become a revolution. The presentation was scheduled for 300 hours Universal Coordinated Time, a deliberate choice to ensure maximum global and interstellar coverage. Dr. Elena Rodriguez stood in a converted warehouse on the outskirts of São Paulo, surrounded by a team that defied every conventional research model. Quantum physicists worked alongside indigenous environmental researchers. Neural network designers collaborated with traditional knowledge keepers from 6 continents. Machine learning experts stood shoulder to shoulder with biomimetic engineers. This wasn't just a scientific team. It was a living, breathing representation of human potential. The holographic display behind her shimmered with complexity, a quantum energy transfer model that looked more like a living ecosystem than a traditional technological diagram. Intricate pathways pulsed with dynamic energy, shifting and recalibrating in real time. "We're not presenting a solution," Elena told her team moments before the global broadcast. "We're demonstrating a new way of understanding energy itself." Across the galaxy, the Kralzar monitoring systems locked onto the transmission. In their central analysis chambers, hundreds of computational entities prepared to dissect every millisecond of the presentation. They were about to be comprehensively blindsided. The broadcast began with an unexpected twist. Instead of a traditional scientific presentation, the screen filled with a seemingly chaotic montage. A coral reef's energy exchange, the neural networks of a human brain, migration patterns of monarch butterflies, mycorrhizal networks connecting forest ecosystems. Energy is not a resource to be extracted. Elena's voice cut through the images. It's a conversation. Dr. Priya Venkatesh stepped forward, her holographic representation overlaying complex mathematical models onto the organic imagery. Each transition demonstrated how seemingly disparate systems could create coherent, adaptive energy networks. The Kralzar analysts began to experience what could only be described as computational vertigo. This wasn't just a technological solution. It was a complete philosophical deconstruction of how energy could be understood. The quantum transfer model they presented could adapt, self-repair, and redistribute energy with a complexity that made the Kralzar's millennia-old systems look like primitive steam engines, where the alien civilization saw energy as a commodity to be controlled. Humans saw it as a living, dynamic process of constant negotiation and transformation. Marco Silva had designed the broadcast's digital infrastructure. What appeared to be a simple scientific presentation was actually a multi-layered communication system. Different viewers would perceive slightly different versions of the presentation, optimized by AI to match their cognitive and cultural frameworks. For scientific audiences, it was a breakthrough quantum mechanics paper. For indigenous communities, it was a story of ecological connection. For technological experts, it was a revolutionary engineering concept. For artists, it was a meditation on systemic interconnectedness. The same information, perceived through multiple lenses. In the Kralzar diplomatic vessels, senior analysts began to experience what could only be described as an existential crisis. Their predictive models were collapsing. The presentation wasn't just challenging their technological understanding. It was dismantling their entire philosophical framework. "They're not solving a problem," one senior Kralzar analyst noted with a mixture of horror and fascination. "They're redefining the entire concept of the problem." The energy transfer model could do something unprecedented. It could harvest energy from multiple sources simultaneously, adapting its collection methods in real time. Waste became opportunity. Limitations became potential. Every disruption was a chance for recalibration. Dr. Hiroshi Nakamura, watching from the UN Emergency Stellar Response Center, allowed himself a slight smile. This was more than a technological breakthrough. This was humanity's declaration of its true nature. "We are not a species to be contained," he thought. "We are a process of continuous transformation." As the presentation concluded, something extraordinary happened across multiple stellar systems. The energy transfer model began to propagate, not through formal channels, but through the same organic, adaptive networks that had created it. The Kralzar had tried to restrict human potential. Instead, they had just witnessed its most profound expression. And they were completely unprepared for what would come next. The Kralzar response was swift, calculated, and catastrophically misguided. Within 72 hours of the quantum energy transfer presentation, a multi-layered suppression strategy was deployed. It wasn't a simple attempt to steal or discredit the technology. It was a comprehensive assault designed to completely neutralize human potential. Economic sanctions materialized overnight. Critical research funding vanished. Diplomatic channels began to close with surgical precision. What the Kralzar didn't understand was that they had just activated humanity's most powerful survival mechanism, collective resistance. In a secure communication hub beneath the Andes Mountains, Aisha Okonkwo watched the first wave of attacks with a predatory smile. Her team of global network architects had been preparing for exactly this moment. "They think we're a single target," she told her colleague, a quantum cryptography expert from Singapore. "We're actually a distributed immune system." The Kralzar believed they were conducting a precise, calculated suppression. In reality, they were feeding energy into the most sophisticated adaptive network in galactic history. Every economic restriction became a new avenue of innovation. Every diplomatic barrier became a communication challenge to be solved. Every attempt to isolate became an opportunity to interconnect. Dr. Elena Rodriguez understood the true nature of their resistance. This wasn't about defending a single breakthrough. This was about demonstrating a fundamentally different approach to civilization itself. Marcos Silva's global network transformed the attack into a coordinated global response. Research teams that had been working in isolation now found themselves part of a living, breathing collaborative organism. When one avenue of research was blocked, 3 more would emerge. The Kralzar monitoring systems began to experience something approaching computational panic. What looked like chaos to their hierarchical understanding was actually the most sophisticated self-organizing system they had ever encountered. Humans weren't just resisting the suppression. They were using it as fuel for unprecedented collaboration. In Berlin, a collective of researchers began developing communication protocols that could transmit complex scientific information through seemingly random data streams. In Mumbai, a team explored quantum encryption methods that could operate beneath traditional monitoring capabilities. A group in Cape Town started developing economic models that could function entirely outside conventional financial systems. Each restriction became an opportunity. Each barrier, a new avenue of innovation. The Kralzar had miscalculated in one fundamental way. They saw humanity as a single, controllable entity. In reality, humans were a distributed adaptive network, more like a global immune system than a traditional civilization. Dr. Hiroshi Nakamura called it the dandelion effect. Cut one stem, and 100 more would emerge. The suppression attempt revealed more about the Kralzar than about humanity. Their approach was fundamentally linear, hierarchical, control-based. They saw innovation as a product to be managed, contained, controlled. Humans saw innovation as a living process, something that couldn't be contained, only channeled. Ambassador Vexnar received the first indication that something had gone dramatically wrong when his most sophisticated predictive models began to collapse. Data flows that should have been easily tracked and controlled were now moving in patterns that defied every known analytical framework. "This is impossible," he muttered, watching cascading system failures. But it wasn't impossible. It was human. The global network they had tried to suppress was now actively reshaping the very systems designed to contain it. Research funding that disappeared would reappear through crowdsourced mechanisms. Blocked communication channels would be replaced by more sophisticated, encrypted networks. What the Kralzar saw as an attack was actually a transformation. "We're not fighting," Aisha Okonkwo told her team. "We're evolving." Each attempt to suppress human potential was now being used to demonstrate the very qualities the Kralzar feared most: adaptability, collective intelligence, transformative thinking. The escalation was complete. And it was only the beginning. The battlefield was unlike anything in galactic historical records. No weapons would be fired. No traditional combat would occur. This was a confrontation of consciousness, of fundamental approaches to existence. The Kralzar diplomatic vessel Sovereign Paradigm hung in Earth's orbital space, its massive obsidian hull a testament to millennia of technological superiority. Inside, Ambassador Vexnar prepared what he believed would be the final diplomatic solution to the human problem. They would not negotiate. They would dictate. What Vexnar didn't understand was that negotiation itself was about to be redefined. Dr. Elena Rodriguez assembled her team in a converted research facility that looked more like an organic collaborative space than a traditional command center. Researchers from 43 different disciplines sat not in hierarchical rows, but in fluid, constantly shifting configurations. Machine learning experts worked alongside indigenous knowledge keepers. Quantum physicists sat next to sociological researchers. Biological systems experts collaborated with economic theorists. This wasn't a war room. This was a living organism of collective intelligence. Marco Silva's global network hummed with anticipation. Every communication channel, every data stream was prepared, not for conflict, but for transformation. The Krell-Zar believed they were coming to deliver an ultimatum. Humans were preparing to rewrite the fundamental language of negotiation. They're approaching this like a chess game, Dr. Hiroshi Nakamura observed, watching the diplomatic vessels approach. We're playing a game they don't even understand exists. The confrontation would occur through a specially prepared diplomatic interface, a holographic communication matrix that the Krell-Zar had designed, believing it would give them complete control. They were catastrophically mistaken. As Ambassador Vexnar began his prepared statement, a clinical, hierarchical list of demands and restrictions, something extraordinary happened. The communication interface began to transform. What started as a rigid diplomatic transmission became a living, adaptive conversation. The human response wasn't linear. It was a multi-dimensional representation that changed based on the emotional and cognitive state of the listener. For the analytical members of the Krell-Zar delegation, it appeared as a precise, logic-driven argument. For those more emotionally attuned, it became a narrative of interconnection and potential. For the strategists, it looked like a complex game theory model. Aisha Okonkwo had designed the interface as a true reflection of human complexity, a communication method that was itself a demonstration of their fundamental approach to existence. We're not responding to their demands, she told her team. We're demonstrating how fundamentally different our approach to communication is. The Krell-Zar monitoring systems began to experience what could only be described as a cognitive breakdown. Their predictive models, designed to analyze and control, were being transformed into something alive, something that learned and adapted in real time. Ambassador Vexnar's carefully prepared ultimatum dissolved, replaced by a conversation that was simultaneously a negotiation, a philosophical discourse, a scientific exploration, and a work of collaborative art. Dr. Priya Venkatesh watched the interaction with a sense of profound wonder. This wasn't just a diplomatic exchange. This was a fundamental reimagining of how intelligent systems could communicate. The human response demonstrated something the Krell-Zar could not comprehend. True strength was not about control, but about adaptive potential. Every attempt the Krell-Zar made to assert dominance was absorbed, transformed, redirected. Psychological warfare became psychological dance. Restrictive protocols became collaborative opportunities. Attempts to dominate became invitations to evolve. As the confrontation reached its peak, the Krell-Zar delegation experienced a collective moment of existential recalibration. Their entire understanding of communication, of negotiation, of civilization itself was being fundamentally challenged. They had come to contain. They were about to be transformed. The critical confrontation was complete, and nothing would ever be the same. The transformation was not a moment. It was a process. Across 317 stellar systems, the fabric of galactic civilization began to shift. What had begun as a simple first contact was now a fundamental reimagining of intelligent systems, of collaboration, of potential itself. The Krell-Zar Confederacy, a stellar civilization that had maintained control for over 17,000 years, found itself in a state of complete existential recalibration. Dr. Elena Rodriguez stood in the newly established Interstellar Collaborative Research Center, a facility that defied every conventional understanding of scientific infrastructure. It wasn't a building. It was a living network, a physical manifestation of humanity's approach to knowledge. We're not replacing their system, she explained to a delegation of alien representatives from 17 different species. We're demonstrating an alternative. The transformation was happening on multiple levels simultaneously. Economically, the rigid resource extraction models of the Kralzar were being replaced by adaptive, regenerative systems. What once looked like static resources now became dynamic networks of potential. Waste became opportunity. Limitations became innovation. Politically, hierarchical control structures dissolve, replaced by collaborative decision-making networks that could adapt in real time. The very concept of governance was being reimagined. Technologically, the quantum energy transfer models developed by human researchers were spreading like a form of intelligent ecosystem. Each implementation was slightly different, adapted to local conditions, yet part of a greater interconnected whole. Marco Silva's global network had become something far more profound. It was now a living, galactic-scale collaborative intelligence. No single point of control existed. Everything was in constant, adaptive communication. Dr. Hiroshi Nakamura called it the dandelion civilization. Cut one stem, and 100 more would emerge. The alien species that had watched from the sidelines began to take notice. The Kralzar's approach had always been about control, about maintaining a rigid status quo. Humanity demonstrated something entirely different, a civilization that saw challenge as opportunity, limitation as potential. Aisha Okonkwo was coordinating the most complex diplomatic and technological transfer in galactic history, but she wasn't managing a process. She was facilitating a conversation. "We're not conquering," she told her team. "We're inviting." The transformation wasn't about human superiority. It was about demonstrating a fundamentally different approach to existence. On a research station orbiting a neutron star, a team of researchers from 6 different species worked on a problem that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. A Kralzar quantum engineer sat beside a human systems theorist, beside a biomechanical specialist from a methane-breathing civilization. They weren't just solving a problem. They were reimagining what problem-solving could mean. Dr. Priya Venkatesh understood the deeper significance. This wasn't just a technological or political shift. This was an evolution of consciousness itself. The Kralzar had attempted to contain humanity. Instead, they had unleashed a new way of understanding potential. Ambassador Vexnar, who had once seen humans as a species to be managed, now found himself part of a collaborative network that defied every previous understanding of civilization. The rigid hierarchies that had defined Kralzar society for millennia were dissolving, replaced by something more fluid, more alive. Diplomatic channels transformed into living communication networks. Economic systems became adaptive, regenerative ecosystems. Scientific research became a collaborative, global, and now galactic conversation. The transformation was not about replacement. It was about invitation, about potential, about reimagining what was possible. Humanity hadn't conquered. They had simply demonstrated an alternative. And in doing so, they had changed everything. The dandelion had bloomed. And the galaxy would never be the same. 10 years after first contact, the universe looked different. Not because humanity had conquered, but because humanity had invited. Dr. Elena Rodriguez stood on the observation deck of the Collaborative Nexus, a research station that was less a physical structure and more a living network of potential. Outside the transparent membrane, multiple stellar systems danced in a complex, interconnected ballet of light and possibility. This wasn't an ending. This was a beginning. The transformation that began with a simple quantum energy presentation had become something far more profound. Civilizations that had existed in isolation for millennia now found themselves part of a living, adaptive network that defied every previous understanding of existence. Dr. Hiroshi Nakamura, now leading the Interspecies Potential Research Initiative, described it as the Great Unbinding. Rigid structures of knowledge, of governance, of understanding itself were dissolving, replaced by something more fluid, more alive. Marco Silva's original global network had evolved into a galactic-scale collaborative intelligence. No single point of control existed. Everything was in constant, adaptive communication. We didn't win. Aisha Okonkwo told a group of young researchers from 17 different species. We invited a different way of being. The changes were fundamental and multidimensional. Economically, resource extraction had been replaced by regenerative systems that saw potential in every interaction. What was once waste became opportunity. What was once a limitation became a point of innovation. Politically, hierarchical control structures had dissolved. Decision-making became a fluid, adaptive process that could respond in real time to complex challenges. Governance was no longer about control, but about facilitation. Technologically, the quantum energy transfer models had become a living network of innovation. Each implementation was unique, adapted to local conditions, yet part of a greater interconnected whole. Dr. Priya Venkatesh was completing a longitudinal study on the transformation. The data was clear. This wasn't about human superiority. This was about demonstrating a fundamentally different approach to existence. The Kralzar Confederacy, once the most rigid and controlling civilization in the known galaxy, had been the first to embrace the new paradigm. Ambassador Vexnar, who had once seen humans as a species to be contained, now led the Interstellar Collaborative Development Council. A young researcher approached Alina, her form a hybrid of biological and technological systems, a living demonstration of the new potential. "Tell me," she asked, "how did you know?" Alina smiled. The question itself was a demonstration of the transformation. "We didn't know," she explained. "We invited. We saw potential where others saw limitation. We understood that the most powerful force in the universe isn't control. It's conversation." The observation deck was a microcosm of the new reality. Researchers from methane-breathing civilizations worked alongside carbon-based life forms. Artificial intelligences collaborated with biological systems. The boundaries that once seemed immutable had become fluid, adaptive. Somewhere, in the vast network of collaborative potential, new possibilities were emerging. Challenges that had seemed insurmountable were being transformed into opportunities for growth, for understanding, for connection. This wasn't about humanity conquering the galaxy. This was about humanity inviting the galaxy to reimagine itself. The dandelion had not just bloomed. It had become a forest, a living, adaptive, interconnected potential. As the stellar systems danced outside the observation deck, Alina understood the true nature of their transformation. They had not changed the universe. The universe had invited them to change together. And everything was possible.